But I'd like to welcome everyone along today to this session at the SCAR 2022 Open Science Conference. If you've joined this stream here, you are tuning into the changing face of Antarctic tourism. We've got an exciting lineup here today with speakers from all around the world. We also have 2 posters as well. So if you haven't had a look already at the poster session, I encourage you to log in there. There's a poster on the survey on the status of Antarctic tourism resources and proactively managing diversification in Antarctic tourism. I'm Dr. Hanne Nielsen. I'll be chairing for you today. We're also joined by several of the other conveners of this session who will have questions for their peers, and I'm very happy to answer questions. Also on the SCAR Tourism Action Group. So we've got Yu-Fai, Leung and Daniela Cajiao here. And the SCAR Tourism Action Group is a group under SCAR that's sort of that umbrella for researchers and practitioners to make new connections and pool existing expertise in order to make up-to-date recommendations on the practice of tourism in the region. And there are a number of outputs being worked on there, including policy advice and workshops and academic outputs. So if you're not involved in that group and would like to be, you can find more information on ANTAG, the Tourism Action Group, via the SCAR website, and we can put a link to that in the chat and in the Q&A. Speaking of the Q&A, we encourage those of you listening today to use that to ask questions of the speakers. We'll have time for a short question after each of those, but we've also got a Q&A discussion scheduled for the end of the session for broader questions for all of our panelists. So if you do have questions, please do enter them as we go, and we'll be picking up on those ones there. And for our speakers as well, today's session is recorded and that will be made available after the fact. If it does turn out that you would not like to have that presentation included, you have a small window to contact the SCAR organisers to request that. But otherwise, this is available for those listening now and later on as well. So welcome to you also. And our very first speaker today is joining us from Turkey with a presentation on Antarctic tourism from a maritime safety perspective. So I'd like to welcome Dorj Ushilia, and thank you. I'll hand over to you for your first presentation in this session.
So thank you very much, Madam Chair, to giving this opportunity, and wish you to have all of you to a wonderful meeting and session. And good evening, good night, good morning, in wherever you are in the world. And today I would like to talk about the Antarctic tourism from a maritime safety perspective. About the content, first of all, we will examine the decadal data of the Antarctic tourism. Then I will give small and brief information about the safety issues in maritime. And finally, I will try to combine all these data to define the future actions. So let's start with the decadal data of Antarctic tourism. So most of you know the numbers of the tourists are getting increasingly year by year. And with the average of the almost 9.5%, these data are increasing yearly. So this information actually tells us more than its popularity or its coming around. These numbers should take in consider with also with the safety issues, just because the Antarctica is one of the most isolated areas in the world. But also with the increasing of these numbers, tourists are not just coming by vessels or to see the around while they were sitting in the vessel. That means they are also having other new activities too. Thanks to IATO, we can reach these kind of data through the website of the database. And as you can see from the table, the total number of activities are getting higher and higher yearly too. As well as there are new sign activities are listed in the list, especially after the 2014 and 2015 season of the Antarctic tourism. So these kind of informations also tells us we need to focus also on the human life, human safety. Not forgetting they are at the Antarctica for the pleasure too also. But as you can see from this chart, the total number of the all kind of activities are getting higher and higher yearly. Especially after the 2014 and the 2015 seasons, each year, at least one new activity started to show up on the IATO database. So this also shows us that the people, the citizens or the tourists, let's say, are looking for the new activities and the new pleasures to have it while they are having a good time in Antarctica and having a good time with the nature, all the wildlife, and maybe being an ambassador, which is the really important project and developed by the IATO. Also, they are looking for this kind of new activities like a polar plank, citizen science, vessel alongside, or snowboarding, polar plank, or snorkeling. These informations are leading us to have another question. If these numbers are getting higher, how can we make people safer in Antarctica, which is really isolated area, just because we cannot reach any other help easily when the people are in the Antarctica. Of course, the vessels have their own safety rules and they have their own rules. But anyhow, even they're just passengers, we need to focus on some other issues. So these increasings, we need to focus on other issues, which is safety. And I would like to pass after this point, after showing that these kind of new activities getting such a much more popular than even the old ones, I would like to pass the other issues, which is a safety issue in maritime. This topic is also kind of my interesting area, just because I am also a seafarer and dealing with the safety issues in vessels. As well as we are organizing the Antarctic and the Arctic expeditions as a Turkey, and I am working in the Polar Research Institute. So I would like to express my idea to share and combine the Antarctic tourism and the experiences and the expeditions also. The expeditioners, I mean scientists, are joining on board in the Arctic or the Antarctica for the expeditions as a passenger, actually. But at the same time, as a Polar Research Institute, we are giving training to all the participants to show how to use especially fire extinguisher, or how can they act in the emergency situation, or how can they do even just for the first aid or the CPR, etc. But before all this kind of information, I will explain these ones in details at the last presentation, at the last slide of my presentation. I would like to give you some detailed info about the maritime, the safety life at sea, or these STCW or ISM code or polar code. Each one has been developed by IMO. International Maritime Organization is one of the biggest rule maker in the world for the maritime safety, not just for the maritime safety, actually, for the whole ruling system for the vessels. So IMO has already defined the safety issues which should be found on the vessels, even for the passenger vessels or the tankers or the bulk carriers, etc. And also they the IMO defined the training systems for the passengers and for the officers too by the STCW code, as well as the ISM code, the International Safety Management Code, was developed after 2000s to have more certificated jobs on the vessels and to follow up all the paperwork easily. And the developed on the idea of the sharing the information between all around the port state controls and the other authorities of the world. And the last one, maybe this one is the most interesting and or interesting area for the Antarctica, the Polar Code, International Code for Ships Operating in Polar Waters. After having a vessel accidents in Antarctica, the argument to having a special code for the Arctic and the Antarctic for the polar areas, I mean, the discussions are getting much more louder in the IMO. And with all this process, around the 10 years between 2007 and 2017, IMO started to develop this polar code and define all extra safety issues should be found on the vessels that are sailing in the polar regions. Of course, there are SOLAS, and SOLAS is already defining all kind of details. For example, the fire doors or etc. But still, Polar Code has extra information for the safety issues, which I'm giving to you in detail in my next slides. So that brings us to Polar Code. The Polar Code defines basically the basic training and advanced training. These two trainings are developed just for the officers, which are navigating in the polar areas. That's correct. Also, the Polar Code defines which kind of vessels should have these kind of training in the capacity of the sea ice condition. Also, the Polar Code defines the extra survival equipments. The first screen on your left side on the screen, you see for the conductor or the management system of the vessels. That's correct. But also the other side, the right side of your screen shows that these are the extra items should be found on the vessel to have efficient management in the emergency situations. Even though these code just developed by the officers or the vessels or the management owners, etc., according to my colleagues and I, these kind of training systems should be developed for the tourists too. And that's where we are combining all the expedition training and the passengers training in Antarctica. We are giving the first aid training or how to live in vessels. Of course, the passengers are not joining to hierarchy system in the vessel, but still there are some rules and these should be taken care of much more seriously than the normal life. I mean, in a hotel in the land, if you push a button wrongly, maybe it's going to be solved in a 1 minute or 2 minutes without having any other major problem. But in vessel, if you push some button without knowing, this could manage much more worse scenario than you think. So that's why we are giving the first aid and how to use Zodiac or how to live in the vessel or how to fight with the fire trainings before we start our expeditions as a Turkey. And these all two informations are bringing us to future actions. According to information paper 75, which was given by the Tourism Antarctic Group of the SCAR to the ATCM, the last ATCM, the Berlin, some kind of future actions are defined in this information paper. And this operation workshop is one of them, as well as the publication. With these all two information that I am focusing on right now, this is bringing us to define the new feature training for the passengers. Of course, without forgetting they are in Antarctica for pleasure. But anyhow, we can make this training method for fun for them too. Especially, for example, when our expeditions are starting, when the researchers are donning the new immersion suits or the other life jacket, etc., they're also having fun and they are looking these kind of experiences so precious. And with all these info, these 4 headlines, I would like to mention about to IATO about its guidelines, about the general information, regulations, and environment rules. IATO has already released many guidelines for the tourists about the wildlife, about the nature, about the Antarctica rules, etc. So we have this kind of database and knowledge already. But on it, we think that the new training should be given by the maritime safety perspective to the passengers. Of course, the passengers are getting their training when they are joining on board by the officers, but they're just learning the muster station and they're just learning to wait the orders when something happened as an emergency. But according to our perspective and the point of view, the passengers should learn much more than these kind of information just because they are in the isolated areas. And it's really important thing to act in emergency without having any panic issues. So safety systems in vessels, communication is the key role to having a better operation in the vessel if something urgent. Usage of basic safety equipments. I am not talking about the EPIRB or SART, search and rescue radar transporter, or something like detailed safety equipments, but at least for the basic ones, how to use EEBD, emergency escape rating device, for example. I think passengers should learn how to use it. And the first aid, CPR, and survival in cold. And about the fire types, extinguishers, and fighting methods. These kind of maybe just the basic ones maybe can save more lives if something happened, emergency. And at the same time, they can have their certificates by this training program, and they will have much more enjoy during their tourism season. And these are my references. Thank you very much for listening and for the time again.
Thank you very much for that presentation. And we see we've got the contact information up there if people would like to get in touch and discuss this further. We do have a number of questions for you there, including in the Q&A, which I hope you can see and perhaps respond to some of those by text there as well. And while I might just give you one of these questions too while our next speaker is getting ready. We had a couple mentioning swimming, including that polar plunge increase from 2017. Do you know why there was a sudden increase there? And also on the swimming, did that swimming distance category include scuba diving? So a couple of questions there for you while Christy, our next speaker, prepares.
Should I answer right now or wait until, okay.
Yeah, so, sure, if you can answer those two and the others answer by text.
Copy that. Thank you very much for giving this chance, and thank you very much for the questions also. So Elizabeth, I don't have the detailed information about it, but I have been examining on the IATO data for years, and this polar activity showed up on the data since 2017. And I don't have the specific information that they had this kind of activity before 2017 or not. But anyhow, I have my note right now, and I will check it, and I will try to give you the precise information. And I am pretty sure we will see each other in the next meeting of the others, of course, and we have this frequently. So I will give the information to you. Thank you very much for asking again.
Thank you for that response there. And of course, the next meeting of the SCAR Standing Committee on Humanities and Social Sciences that's being referred to will be held next year in Lisbon. We can share that information at the end of the session. So thank you to our first speaker. We'll move on now to hear from our second speaker. We've got Christy here presenting for us today on polar impact, utilising self-determination theory to maximise the pro-environmental potential of youth expeditions. So welcome, thanks for joining us, and I'll hand over to you, Christy.
Great. Hi everyone, can you hear me and see me okay? Perfect. Well, yeah, thanks. If our paths haven't crossed yet, then my name is Christy and I am a conservationist, environmental psychologist, polar alien hunter and lecturer at the University of Surrey here in the UK. So today I am in London collaborating with Pat Meyer, who is in Canada, and Emma Stewart, who is in New Zealand. So we are a fully international team working in Antarctica, which I think is a thing to be celebrated in itself. My day job is my passion, and so I research how tourism experiences can better connect us to the places we have been and the species we have seen. So in Antarctica, but equally a bit more broadly and widely in terms of last chance tourism. Today, I will be presenting on behalf of Pat and Emma too, who are also on the call, so I'll pitch in if you feel the need. And I'll be presenting part 2 of a collaborative study between ourselves and also working in collaboration with Students on Ice to evaluate the long-term impact of participating in a youth expedition to polar regions and what this has on participants' pro-environmental behaviours up to 18 years after they visited. So exasperating vulnerability. So increasingly, we're seeing headlines such as "Should tourists be banned from Antarctica?" And the ethics of travel to this region is starting to be questioned more and more. This theoretical model explains how the climate emergency creates a kind of vicious circle and increases the growth in demand for last chance or Antarctic tourism. Essentially, climate change and loss in biodiversity create the supply side for last chance tourism, as it can cause the vulnerability of the places and species to visit. Last chance tourism then increases the already present pressures on the environment through both direct impacts, so things like tourist on-site activities or infrastructure, and indirect impacts, such as emissions for even getting there in the first place. And so this exacerbates the vulnerability of the destination. And ironically, perhaps, the more concern, the more tourists. And we just saw from the previous presentation, the increase in tourists to this region. So what does our study do? How does it contribute to this? So youth-based expeditions to the polar regions have been offered for the last 2 decades. Common across most of these programs is a desire to immerse participants in the polar regions in order to offer, to help them understand a new understanding and respect for the polar environment, to share their experiences and enthusiasm with others when they get back home, and to really grow awareness of the polar regions and take action more broadly on environmental issues. And we often use the term polar ambassadorship, but what does that really mean? And how long do these impacts happen? So our research aims to explore how adventurous education programs can act as a stimulus to career and pro-environmental behaviours, as I've said, up to 18 years after their polar voyage. And I think that's a really exciting part of this research, is that we're actually seeing what difference it made so many years after people travelled. So what was the method? What did we actually do for this research? So participants were recruited from the alumni from the Students on Ice database. And Students on Ice, if you don't know it, is a Canadian-based charitable organisation that leads educational expeditions to the polar regions for international high school and university students. So participants in this study, importantly to say in this context, visited either the Arctic and or Antarctica. The study adopted was mixed methods, and it was co-designed with Students on Ice throughout the whole process. And it was collected by an online survey. And in total, we had 228 students who were aged between 14 to 17 at the time of the expedition, who are now aged between 21 and 40. 69% of participants in the survey were female. So part one of this study was published last year in the Journal of Sustainable Tourism. And this study tested the direct and indirect relationships between previous Students on Ice students' social identity towards the alumni program and their subsequent connections with nature and pro-environmental behaviours. And so what we're doing in study two is focusing on what pro-environmental behaviours did these participants talk about and what were the long-term impacts of these. So one of the pro-environmental behaviours that came out most often was talking about career choice. And so, for example, we've had quotes in the research that says, after my Students on Ice expedition, I decided to go to college for environmental science with a specific focus on the oceans. I am now getting a PhD in Arctic marine ecology. Another one said, I came back from a trip, a changed person, got into political and environmental activism and pursued a career in environmental education. So part of the study was understanding what pro-environmental behaviours occurring. And the second part was thinking about what was it about their experience that triggered some of these. So how then, what is kind of this recipe for change that we're starting to come up with? So how did such trips lead to career choice and prolonged environmental actions? Our study suspects, and we're only about 3/4 of the way through it now, that self-determination theory might be able to play a part. Self-determination theory is based on the notion that humans gravitate toward activities of growth and integration. More specifically, Decker and Ryan claim that intrinsic motivation is dependent on the satisfaction of 3 psychological needs to experience autonomy, competence, and relatedness. So in our new second study, links these 3 elements of self-determination theory within the learning process during the expedition itself that created meaningful interactions between the students, the education team, and the polar environment that subsequently impacted upon future life choices for the students. So some examples for each. So for competence, it was about learning or feeling effective in bringing about desired outcomes, challenging situations that enhances individual skills. For relatedness, it was a lot about connectedness. Now this might be connectedness to the social group, to the peers that they were with, perhaps to the educators that were also on the trip, or connectedness to the environment. And autonomy was thinking about options and skill development. So thinking about an individual self and origin of behavior and being able to make their own decisions. So I'll share a few quotes from each of those that kind of sum up a little bit of the data for you. So this Arctic participant, aged 14 at the time of the trip, said the experience was awe-inspiring. There is so much to be learned by reading and looking at pictures. My physical and emotional experience in the Arctic is hard to quantify in words. It has fundamentally changed how I look at the world. An example of relatedness. So we have an Arctic participant aged 18 this time. I think these moments led to a profound moment where I felt connected to the land and felt a sort of empathy for the planet. And that's quite interesting to draw on people thinking just about Antarctica, but equally more broadly about the wider environments. And that's really what we wanted to pull out of this study. Do people visit Antarctica and simply only focus on Antarctica when they come back? Or actually, are they able to look beyond that and think about wider environmental issues? So thinking about results for autonomy. So a participant from the Arctic, aged 14 at the time of their trip, said, these are very precious moments from an unpressionable time in my life. They have stuck with me to this day, reminders of a trip that has inspired my career in conservation. Alongside those 3, we're also figuring out and finding other examples. So perhaps we can also add to this theory by thinking about other concepts. So uniqueness, for example. And here's a couple of quotes that talk about uniqueness. So one from, actually they're both from participants who have been from the Arctic and Antarctic, lucky participants. The first one says they were incredibly unique and intimate feeling. The ship felt like it was a world away from anything I knew back home. And the second one is once in a lifetime experiences, full of awe, anchoring memories throughout the expedition. So what's coming soon then? What key things is this research hopefully going to tell us, and new insights is it going to bring to the field of Antarctic ambassadorship? So first, looking at new insights into understanding those three elements of self-determination theory in tourism in more detail, but equally in relation to Antarctic tourism. I think what's really exciting from this research is thinking about what activities during a trip supported each one of these elements. So once we can start to understand what links some of these feelings and emotions to the actual specific activity or their moment that they really remember when they had this kind of eureka moment, then obviously we can work really closely with students and I to include more of these in their itineraries and hopefully increase the self-determination. So I've pulled out a few examples here. So from autonomy, so the shift to feel like home and leaving my comfort zone. Relatedness, so a cultural showcase and a talent show. Being in this melting pot of all different cultures from around the world and feeling that's a safe space to ask questions and get to know different cultures and think of kind of global solutions. And then time, alone time, meditative time, contemplation time is also quite key in relatedness and thinking about how you can connect to these new places. And lastly, competence, so learning in the field from experts and being on the boat together. So there's one thing kind of learning and having lectures, but there's another thing then when you're sat next to these inspiring experts on board and having dinner and having more informal conversations with them and kind of really making relationships and bonds with these people. And hearing from storytellers. That's particularly true, we found out, in the Arctic, where they had natives on board and then being able to share their stories, and then the participants felt more comfortable to then ask questions when they were going and meeting locals when they were off the boat. Last but not least, I always like to promote a bit of impact. And so how do we work closely with students and ICE, and what difference does our work really make? So we take a community engaged approach, and that basically means that we work alongside students on ICE at all times during the process. And an example of this is that students on ICE have used our research to assist them with future planning and funding applications. And so what they did was use some of our statistics, you can see there on the right-hand side of your screen, in their 20-year evaluation report. So these are statistics that have come from our database, but actually aren't used in our journal articles, but it's just additional information that they wanted to collect that can really help them further too. So I really do recommend a community engaged research approach if you're thinking about collaborative research going forward. So lastly, thank you so much for your time. That was a whistle-stop tour, but I look forward to your questions and feedback. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thanks very much for that fascinating presentation, Christy. And I see we also have another of your co-authors here online. Of course, they would be very happy to answer questions after the fact, but we do have time for one or two questions just now as well. I might kick this off with sort of a combined question. We've had a few here in the chat as we're going about the extent to which those participants were already a self-selected group of people who were self-aware and open-minded students with a connection with environmental issues. So Daniela Liggett asking, how are you taking into consideration that those participants are not randomly chosen? And Elizabeth Lean having a similar question there as well. Is there a possibility that people who responded were those who had been impacted positively? Were there many in the sample who were not particularly positive?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think it's true. I think there's always going to be self-selection bias in this type of work that we do. We're asking people to talk about themselves, and they will probably be positive, share the positive things, and equally even be more positive than they really feel, because they think they're going to complete the questions that they want you to hear. That said, I think this gives us a really good starting point to start to understand some of these things. Moving forward, I would love to compare students on ice to other studies, and even so other youth groups to get a bit more perspective, but equally to compare some of these results to perhaps an adult trip to see what the difference is there. So no, I fully agree that this is slightly dangerous territory, I guess, in terms of self-selection bias and so on, but I think it's a good start. And I think the difference between this research than others is that long-term that longevity of it. So hopefully we can get some new insights there to share. But yes, we've got a lot of work to do between us all to get over that response bias.
Thank you for that, Christy. And I see we've got a number of other questions in the chat here, in the Q&A. So it would be great if you could hop on over there and give some answers by text. We've got questions about self-determination theory and other questions about those pro-environmental examples. It's great to see that interest. So if we could continue that conversation in that arena. Thank you to Christy. And we will move on now to our next presentation. Adaptive Management of Sustainable Tourism in Antarctica. And for this presentation, our presenter is actually one of the co-leads of the Scout Tourism Action Group. So I'll hand over now to Daniela Cajiao to talk to us for the next 15 minutes. Thank you, Daniela.
Thank you very much, Hanne, and good morning, good afternoon, and good night to everybody who is joining us. Yes, I want to present on behalf of my co-authors, who is Pablo Tejedo, Javier Penayas, and Yu-Fai Leung, the results of this paper that we published last year, and you can see here. There is Adaptive Management of Sustainable Tourism in Antarctica, a rhetorical work in progress. So as Dorak already told us, that it was very clear, tourism in Antarctica is increasing and also diversifying in the number of activities that are carry on in Antarctica, which is raising concerns about the impacts, the sustainability, the spatial concentration of these activities, and not only researchers, but also the academia, policymakers has been emphasizing on the need for a comprehensive management of Antarctic tourism. So considering this context, we posed a question that was, what factors have hindered the adoption and implementation of an adaptive management approach for Antarctic tourism? And as you may know, adaptive management, this approach consists on a cyclical process of 5 different steps in which you assess, design, implement, monitor, and evaluate different management measures that you could put in place in a destination, in this case that we are talking about tourism, let's say protected areas, for example. And this is a rationale that allows you to evaluate whatever measure and whatever management action you are doing. We decided to apply this approach because we saw positive experiences of implementation of this adaptive management approach around protected areas in the world, and which has shown really positive benefits for managers, especially when they are deciding on what to do, what visitor sites, how to use these different sites. So we consider that if we are analyzing what is going on with Antarctic tourism, this could be an interesting approach to do. So within this paper, we analyze the context of tourism management in Antarctica. We review which of these 5 elements of adaptive management concerning tourism management have been or are being applied in Antarctica. We examine the extent to which these elements has been incorporated, and we propose some specific actions that we can take to approach to take a more adaptive management approach to Antarctic tourism. How we do this? We conducted a lead appraisal of policy documents and Antarctic tourism and Antarctic tourism management peer review papers. For the policy documents, we look into the Antarctic 3D database, and we collect all the papers starting 1962 to 2021, and that were related to working groups, intersessional contact groups, and meeting of experts. After that, we also did a search in this databases, Scopus and Web of Science, and we completed this search with our own databases, the authors' databases, and we gathered at the end 127 peer-reviewed papers. After applying some filters on how we can actually analyze these papers, because some of them were just mentioning tourism or making just conclusion about tourism, so we apply a filter and we decided to analyze 72 papers in depth. What were our results? When it comes to the policy documents that we investigated, we found 10 different recommendations, 5 decisions, and 32 resolutions that have been adopted and implemented starting 1979 and finalized in 2021. One interesting thing is that we can classify all these different resolutions, decisions, and recommendations that actually are now called resolutions in 8 different topics, as you can see here. And one of these topics is obviously related to an strategic approach of tourism management, as you can see here. And an important amount of this is also related to site guidelines for visitors, as we all know. Another thing that we found in here is that to date, the Antarctic Treaty System has been conducting 24 intersessional contact groups. Now we may have more with these last 2 sessions, treating 18 different topics and having 4 meetings of experts. In order, these are the countries that have been contributing more with tourism decisions, with tourism resolutions, with tourism work in Antarctica. And at the end, we also counted a total of 21 ICG reports, 1 tourism study that it was conducted by the CEP, and 57 different documents containing working papers and informative papers related to the meeting of experts that have been held during this period of time. One important thing that I want to mention here is that in 1972, the areas for special tourist interest were proposed by the parties, and in 1992, an annex on tourism was also proposed by the parties. However, this never really happened, and this was not adopted, but it's super interesting because now we can see that tourism was always an important matter for the treaty, and obviously, there are many constraints that we face with tourism management, but this is an example of how tourism was also considered since the beginning. When we analyzed the peer-reviewed papers, these 72 papers, we did several comparisons, but the one I am showing you here is in which we identify these 4 big categories of topics in here, and we did identify which one belongs to one of these 5 different steps of adaptive management. And as you can see here, implementation is the one that receives the majority in which we found the majority of proposal and results. However, it is interesting for me also to mention that we found that 34 mentions for strategically comprehensive and adaptive management of Antarctic tourism, which is really interesting during all this work. So I just want to emphasize this whole 1992 that contains the first proposal for implementing an adaptive management approach. Davis in 1999, who made the first implementation of the recreation opportunities spectrum for the Antarctic Peninsula, and Lammers in 2000, who developed and actually developed the concept of the Antarctic tourism opportunities spectrum, which was not further developed. However, it's really interesting for us to see that not only the parties, but also the academia and researchers were always considering the importance and the need for a comprehensive management of Antarctic tourism. So considering all this, what has happened and what have hindered the adoption of this adaptive management approach for Antarctic tourism? Well, as we all know, Antarctica is a global commons that is managed under a unique governance regime in which we require unanimity for taking any single decision. And sometimes the resolutions or sometimes the recommendations or proposal could contain or could be seen as a potential having potential inconsistency with domestic legislation. So that could prevent some parties for actually adopting some of these recommendations and resolutions. And obviously the lack of a sovereign government, different from protected areas in which we have a government who is actually deciding what to do, has also is also one of the constraints for this. Considering this scenario, we still think there are possibilities for implementing like a gradual adaptive management approach for Antarctica. In this case, we were considering that enhancing collaboration among different stakeholders in Antarctica and considering these 5 steps of this cyclical process could contribute. So you can see here that we have identified in every one of these steps different actions that different stakeholders can take, and we have in here researchers and academia here, and we have also the SCAR moderating this, and we have the tourism advisory group that we call in the paper, doing this important work on networking and also connecting different steps, but also different stakeholders. And we can see also IATO that has an important role in the implementation, the monitoring, the evaluation of some of the measures or some of the activities we want to implement. And I am happy to tell that since this paper, many things have happened within the SCAR, within some projects and some research that we have been conducting. So last year in 2021, November, I think it is, the Antarctic Tourism Action Group was formally established, as Hanne mentioned at the beginning, and she also shared the link. So we are really happy now to have 4 years for startup working in different activities that could enhance this collaboration among different parties. And we also have, and we do recognize that we still have these concerns about the increase in tourism. Now that we are having the projections of the new season are really interesting in the terms of number of people that will be arriving to Antarctica. So we still have that. We still have those concerns. However, we have also some work that have been done have been completed during this time, that is identifying some research priorities through one of the projects that also the ANTAC group is participating. We still have the ongoing systematic conservation planning that will contribute to the planning and use of the Antarctic Peninsula and some visitor sites. We have new research projects, and I am referring here to the Dutch projects that were just approved this year, at the beginning of this year. And we have the ANTAC as an important group that is now catalyzing some of this work and enhancing all this collaboration. So that was everything I want to mention here, and I want to present the results of this document, and I will be happy to listen to any questions or respond to any questions you may have. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for that presentation, Daniela. That's really great to hear about some of that work and particularly see that process of following that through. I think we've had a few of our panelists moved to attendees, so if we could have that rectified, that would be excellent. And I think we have time for one question for Daniela as Yu-Fai is getting the screen ready for the next presentation. If there was a question on this presentation that anyone would like to share here in this case. I've got a couple of screens going. We've got a whole lot of questions all over the place, actually. So while Yu-Fai prepares, Daniela, was there anything particularly surprising that you found in the process of this particular project, looking at all those ATS documents? Was it what you expected, or was there anything that really jumped out at you as unusual?
I think that was more than expected. It was not really expected that we will find a lot of mentions of for strategically and comprehensive management of Antarctic tourism, not only from the academia, but also from the policymakers. And this is super important considering the fact that tourism is increasing. Tourism presents a lot of concerns. So I think that we have been doing, and when I said we, it's like in the past and now, present, probably future. We are obviously trying to propose and advocate for this comprehensive management. And it is also super important to recognize that the parties have been also doing the same in a different way. However, the implementation and the adoption of this has been always a constraint.
Thank you so much for that response and for your presentation, Daniela. And again, as questions come in through the Q&A, our panelists can respond to those as well. And I see we do have another presentation coming up that's sort of looking at those futures. So I think what we might do now is we'll move to our next speaker, which is Daniela Cajiao, again, with behavioural responses of 2 penguin species to human presence at a popular tourist site in the Antarctic Peninsula. And if you do have questions for Yu-Fai, you can pop them in the Q&A, or we can address those together at the end as well. But we will come back to Daniela now for some very cute looking penguins and information about those. Thanks, Daniela.
Thank you, Hanne. Hello again. I want to present some results of a study we conducted to assess the behavioral responses of penguin species to human presence. This work was published this year, and my co-authors, as you can see here, this work is available at Antarctic Science. And what we want to do is to assess what are the responses of 2 specific species to human presence using one highly visited site in the Antarctic Peninsula. So for us, the question was, what are the differences between chinstrap and gentoo penguins in their behavior responses to simulated tourist activities? That was the question we asked. And for that, as I told you, we work in Barrientos, Icho Island, which is located in the South Shetlands in the Antarctic Peninsula. Is one of the 15 most popular visited sites in the Antarctic Peninsula. And the place in which we work, it was the South Beach area that I marked here in red. And here you can see also, this is a zoom in of the area. You can see in purple, those correspond to nesting sites of gentoo penguins, and the yellow part in here correspond to chinstrap penguins. The red dots means the nesting areas that we work and in which we conducted all our treatments in here. We work on the summer of 2019-2020 at the end of December and the early week of January, because the chicks are most vulnerable during the seasons. We can still find the parents in the nest. As you can see here, these little and tiny chicks that could be disturbed by any accidental activity by humans, but also by natural causes, like the presence of skuas, for example. What were the methods that we applied for this research? Basically, we have 5 different treatments, and I want to say in here that we are presenting the results of a larger data set in which we conducted treatments that included also crouching and standing. But here I will be presenting the results of a treatment that included human talking sound, that it was us talking, and also distance and speed. And you can see here the different treatments that we apply with the different variables that we measure. We have one passive human treatment that consisted in 10 to 15 meters and no moving. And the actives were a combination of different speeds and different distances that we perform. At the end, we conducted 53 repetitions for the passive human presence, and we did 53 repetitions for the active human presence. So we had this combination of these 5 treatments. And the way in which we work is that we define the nesting area as any conglomeration of penguins. That we can define this because it's a good number. We have a number or a kind of number, but they were having this shape, a shape that we can define. And when we were in the field, we decided to have this side A and side B that allow us to have a better recording of the treatment we were applying. So even though we selected the nesting areas in a random way, then we were actually doing side A and side B to have at the end to have the same repetitions and not to just do the same repetition over the same side. This is just a screenshot of us when we were conducting one of the experiments. You can see here this tiny flag that was for us an indication of the distance. And here we are just, I can imagine we were talking or we were just doing something. And then here you can see this is the interface that the software we use, which is Boris. As you can see here, this software was developed for doing counting and actually for counting and assessing wildlife behavior in different working with different species. So I think this is not the first one. Actually, we got a recommendation by Dr. Heather Lynch on using this software for doing this counting. We built an ethogram consisting of 10 different behaviors corresponding to 4 different behavioral classes. We extracted this from the literature that was already published. And this was the categories that we actually counted on the Boris software that you just saw. So what did we find with this? So basically we found that gentoo penguins and chinstrap, they behave in a way some different. Chinstrap penguins seems to be more presenting more this strong vigilance that we call, that seems to be they are more nervous. Even with the passive or the active human presence, they show more time, and you can see the proportion of time was higher if we compare with gentoo penguins. However, gentoo penguins, they always display more like vigilance. They were always alert, even with a passive human presence and the active human presence, as you can see here. And both species remain under more comfort and rest under the passive treatment, as you can see here in the red bar. And when we were comparing this, one of the things we saw here is that chinstrap penguins show less comfort and rest at 5 and 2 meters at different speeds. We can be walking like one stride per second or 2, but they were showing less comfort. So no matter the speed, they were showing less comfort, and also no matter the distance, they were showing this less comfort. And what happened with gentoo penguins here is that you can see, and this corresponds also to the other table, to the other graph that we saw, is that they were showing more this like vigilance that we call, that is like this constant or permanent alert that they were showing all the time. No matter the distance, no matter the speed, they were always showing this alert behavior. And one thing that we also saw, and which is consistent with the other graph, is that chinstrap seems to be more alert all the time, displaying this strong vigilance with the distance, including 10 meters. So this was just interesting for us to ask if even these 5 meters that are part of the site guideline are enough, or we have to consider any other measure. So part of the implications and the future research that we are proposing here, and that which you can find in the paper, is that probably we may need to take a more precautionary approach when having these different visitor site guidelines. We agree with many authors that they say that it is needed to conduct more specific research under specific visitor sites and their specific studies, but we also consider that probably establishing temporal and spatial restrictions could be one way in which we can actually apply this adaptive management approach, because we can design, implement, and then evaluate if this is needed or not. But probably during the first stage of the breeding season, we may need to have a more precautionary approach that could be having this slow speed, this no talking at all, and having at least 10 meters distance during this specific stage. We also think that we may need more specific studies. We may need to simulate more activities like being actual tourists, not just being like deploying the experimenting in colonies that were not visited or not previously exposed, but also making this comparison with other visitor sites, but also considering different stages, because now we know that the Antarctic season is starting actually October, late October, and some of these could also include the incubation period, and also monitor and detect if there are any specific impacts or indicators that we can follow with this. So this is part of the things that we found with this specific study. And as I am telling you, this is specific for one island. This is specific for these two species. We cannot say that this is something that we can generalize for all the species, all the sites, all the seasons, or wherever. This is just very specific, but it's interesting to see that even though we have been applying these precautionary measures and having this 5 meters rule, and we are always encouraging people and tourists not to approach a lot, not to talk, and not being loud and so on. The different stages could be an important factor when determining these specific visitor site guidelines. And we need to consider that species may react different as well. So we may need to have some studies as well with Adelaide penguins, for example, that could show a different pattern, or maybe just confirm the pattern that we are finding here. But this is something that we just wanna call for your attention, and maybe you are interested in also continue with this kind of thoughts in the future. So that was everything I wanna show. Thank you so much, Hanne.
Thank you very much for that presentation, Daniela. And it sounds like that research is really useful and could be very helpful for informing more nuanced guidelines or training for researchers, or for, in fact, the guides who interact with these species and with these sites on a regular basis. So thank you very much for that presentation. We are at the 15 minutes for this talk. So if anyone in the audience has a question, please do put that in the Q&A, and we will look forward to the next steps and that next survey, which, as mentioned, will come out via some of those mailing lists, particularly for the Tourism Action Group and potentially SCPAS as well, for that wider community. As our next speaker gets ready, I might wonder if we might just ask you one question there about some of those demographics. Do you know, Yu-Fai, how common it was for the respondents there to be involved in Antarctica in more than one way? So as an academic and a guide? And might that tell us something about that tourism research community as well?
I don't have a exact number, but I think there are multiple responses on that question. How are you engaged with Antarctic tourism? Yeah, there are multiple responses, but we haven't kind of sorted out the multiple responses yet. So, but this would be something that we would include in the definitely in the manuscript that we would report with the research agenda. So
yeah, fantastic. I think it's always very interesting to think about the different audiences and how people are reaching those different audiences. And I say that also as someone who was working as an academic or working on a ship at one point.
That's right.
So thank you very much for that, Yu-Fai. I think we will have a chance at the end of this whole session for questions to all our panelists. So those listening, if you have some of those bigger picture questions, start getting those ready. But at this moment, I would like to introduce Professor Elizabeth Leung from the University of Tasmania, and she will be talking about an upcoming project, so the Curated Continent, Mediating the Antarctic Tourist Experience. So welcome, Ali, and I'll hand over to you. Ali, we'll just need you to unmute for the presentation.
Thanks, Hanne. I'm having a few technical difficulties here. Everyone's frozen and it's all a bit disconcerting, and I'm having difficulty finding my usual buttons. But now I have, so I presume you can hear me?
We can hear you and we can see your project outline slide.
Great, thank you very much. I've just got a bit of an unstable connection, so bear with me. All right, hi everyone. Today I'm speaking to you from Nipaluna Hobart in Lutruwita, Tasmania, and I acknowledge with deep respect the traditional owners of this land, the Muinina and Palawa people. And I'm speaking on behalf of a group of co-authors or co-participants in a project, most of whom are here. And I'll be promoting them to panelists if I get any testing questions so that they can address them. So this presentation is to introduce a new research project that will focus on exploring the mediated nature of Antarctic tourism. So first of all, a little bit about the project. It's funded through the Australian Research Council under their linkage scheme, which is a scheme that tries to connect academia with industry. And it goes for 2 years. It was awarded in May of 2020, which really wasn't great timing for a project focused on Antarctic tourism. So it was delayed considerably due to the pandemic, and we started up in June 2020. So we've really just begun. And this presentation is not about reporting any findings, but rather just giving visibility to other people in the field about what we've got planned. And I'm hoping that we'll get some feedback from you and ideas, if not now, then down the track. Now, we're working with Intrepid Travel, who are an Australian-based company. They're the largest small group adventure travel company in the world. And recently they've moved into the Antarctic cruise market. So the project's going to look at how Antarctic tour operators like Intrepid, through their mediation activities, shape the Antarctic experience, and particularly with respect to people of different national and cultural backgrounds. Oops. Sorry, still having my technical difficulties. Now, this term, the curated continent, might seem a little bit surprising, given that Antarctica is usually considered synonymous with the wild and the remote. So I'm just going to try to explain what we mean here. According to Michael Bhaskar, who's the author of a popular book entitled Curation, that term has become a real buzzword. He says that there's a tsunami of data that we're receiving in a huge range of fields, which means that value doesn't really lie in more information anymore, but rather in better curated information. And that argument, I think, really resonates when you think of things like the lists of books to read or recommendations of films to watch, music to play, those kinds of things. But in the case of tourism, and particularly Antarctic tourism, the situation is perhaps a bit more complicated. Bhaskar says that places and experiences are now to be curated, not taken as a generic package. Over the last 30 years, the old pattern of package tourism gave way to the independent traveller, the backpacker, the explorer. And he argues that value now lies in the curation of bespoke, tailor-made, experiential tourism. Now, Antarctica might seem like an ideal destination for someone who likes the idea of being an explorer, but it also offers some really specific challenges in that regard. Because of course, no one actually visits Antarctica as an independent traveller, or almost no one. You might think of people attempting solo crossings and those sorts of things, but they're almost always supported by a commercial logistics company. You might think of people travelling in small yachts, but they still need, of course, their permits and their permissions. Nobody can just sort of rock up to Antarctica and go where they want, not legally anyway. And anyway, as we know, the vast majority of Antarctic tourists don't travel that way, but rather with cruise ships, where their itineraries are out of their control. Their autonomy when off the vessel is pretty minimal. They are usually landed in roped off areas. They're driven around in zodiacs by guides. They might do adventure activities, as we saw earlier, like camping or scuba diving, but even those, of course, have to be carefully supervised in an extreme environment. So both the physical environment of Antarctica and its governance means that the tourist experience is by necessity intensely curated. That is, a small selection of places and experiences are chosen to present to the tourist. Of course, the tourist can curate their own experience by choosing a particular operator, but once they're aboard, it is the operator, along with, of course, the weather and the environment, that determines the experience. Now, that means that the Antarctic tourist experience is also intensely mediated. That is, the tourist operator is constantly present, framing, interpreting the experience through things like onboard enrichment programs, lectures, activities, and guided excursions. But despite the scholarly attention to polar tourism, and we all know there's been quite a lot of that, the nature of this mediation and its role in tourist experience of Antarctica hasn't really been systematically examined. And we looked for articles focusing particularly on mediation of Antarctic tourism and could find very little, except one back in the 1990s. So we're really interested in the impact of this mediation on tourists. And of course, that's going to depend So that's going to vary depending on the tourist's own background and experiences. We know that Antarctic tourist demographics are changing. 25 years ago, the 5 largest nationalities represented in Antarctic tourists were the US at the top end, Germany, Argentina, the UK, and Brazil. In the last few years, at least before the pandemic, they were the US still at the top, but then China, followed by Australia, UK, and Germany. So in recent years, up until the pandemic, China has seen the greatest proportionate rise of tourists, and predictions are for those numbers to keep increasing. And India too may well be a large market base in the future. So that diversification creates significant opportunities for a wider range of people to experience Antarctica firsthand and learn about its natural and human histories. But it also means that tourist companies, who do remain predominantly Western owned and operated, are functioning in a really complex environment in which not only personal, but also cultural and national differences are influencing expectations, behavioural norms, and understandings of the Antarctic region. Cultural attitudes towards the continent, as we know, can be remarkably varied. People like Scott and Shackleton and Mawson might weigh really heavily on the British or the Australian, the Anglophone imagination, but very contrasting exploration histories and geopolitical relations and attitudes towards landscape and wilderness will mean that travellers from places like India or Norway or China or Argentina, just to name some randomly, could understand the region really quite differently. But we're only at the beginning of understanding what those changing demographics are going to mean for Antarctic tourism and how a person's cultural and national background will influence the way in which they experience the southern polar region. So the overarching aim of this project is to discover how cruise ship tourism can foster positive and culturally informed relationships with Antarctica among diverse groups of visitors. So we've got 4 key research questions. First of all, how and to what extent are the expectations and preconceptions that tourists bring to their Antarctic experience influenced by their national and cultural background? Secondly, how does the operator's mediation of the tourist experience contribute to the formation of Antarctic place attachment? And by that we mean the bond, the connection that people form with Antarctica. And what role does sensory experience, the actual direct experience of place, play in the formation of this place attachment? And then how does it interact with preconceptions and mediation? And based on those answers, we're interested in what steps operators can take through their mediation to foster a relationship with Antarctica that's meaningful for diverse visitors. So we've got a large and diverse team working on this, although we are all based at the University of Tasmania, so we're tight-knit in that way. I'm leading the project. I've always been interested in how Antarctica is mediated for people, although originally I was looking at that through things like literature and written text. My interest has moved into tourism, among other things. We've got 2 specialist tourism scholars on the team, Kansang Wee, who's here now, and Anne Hardy. Kansang specialises particularly in Asian tourism and done a lot of work on cruise ship tourism. Carolyn Philpott, who's also here, is really interested in that multisensory nature of the experience, particularly the role that sound plays in the Antarctic experience. We're often fixated on the visual with tourism. Hanne, you'll know because she's convening this session, very interested in Antarctic tourism, particularly from the perspective of the guide. And Katie Marks, our postdoc, whose PhD is on indirect place attachment to Antarctica. And then Intrepid Travel, our collaborators there will be contributing to the project design and analysis and supporting us for onboard activities during the field work. So a quick word on methods. Field work is really an integral component of our project. Intrepid have really generously provided 8 berths on their ship Ocean Endeavour over the next 2 summer seasons. So we'll be doing 4 voyages with our researchers travelling in pairs and conducting semi-structured interviews with tourists on the way down and the way back, as well as doing some participant observation. We do have the ability to conduct interviews in 6 languages, including Mandarin, although I think the diversity of the clientele might be impacted by the pandemic. We're just going to have to see what happens in that regard. And then we're going to observe things like the content delivery of onboard enrichment activities, lectures, quizzes, auctions, those sorts of things, the kinds of commentary and narrative offered by guides during their cruises and continental landings, the sorts of activities that deal with bodily encounter with the environment, like the polar plunge or on-deck social events, as well as just general information session and voyage recaps. There's some milestones along the way, and they're going to revolve around those 2 seasons of fieldwork. So we'll be conducting a preliminary analysis of our data in 2023 following our first season, and that will feed into the second season of fieldwork. And we hope to share some of those emergent results with you next year at the CHAS conference, the biennial conference in Portugal and Lisbon. And then we'll be doing our final analysis after the second fieldwork season in 2024. And we really hope to share final results with you at the same conference as this one in 2 years' time. So that's it from me. And please do get in contact with me or any of the other participants if you have questions or ideas or just want to share what you're doing with us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ellie, for that presentation, which is the final presentation in our session here today. We do have time for questions to Ellie, and then we have a little bit of time set aside as well for questions to all of our panelists that might be sort of taking a step back on that topic of Antarctic tourism more generally. So if you have questions for these particular for a particular speaker, you can let us know, or more general questions here as well. Ellie, of course, been talking about that curation of the place. Ellie, I wonder if your own experience of going down to Antarctica in different capacities, and including more recently on a tour ship, how did that inform your thinking around this project and that question of curation?
Very strongly, I think. I think it was Carolyn and I did a trip with a tour operator a couple of years ago, and it was really during that project that during that trip that this project was developed. And interestingly, this relates to Daniela's question as well. We actually, during that trip, met 2 employees of Intrepid Travel who were on the ship as well, and we began talking to them, and that's how this project evolved. So Intrepid have been a really key part of it right from the start, and the grant that we've got is in partnership with them. So yes, Daniela, the project's very much endorsed and supported by the tour operator in this case, and that's really key because you know, doing the field work really requires that. So yes, I think although I was interested in Antarctic tourism, coming from my interest in travel writing and travellers in Antarctica, I think that tourist trip that I did made a big difference in just my own personal interest in the field and also in evolving the project. And Daniela's got another question, I think.
Thank you, Ellie. Shall I just jump in there, Hanne?
Yeah, go ahead.
I just have a quick follow-up question for Ellie as well, and please apologize if I missed that, but you mentioned as main techniques semi-structured interviews, research methods. I mean, do you also consider participant observation to play a role? And if so, what kind of personal backgrounds and biases do you potentially think you have to take into consideration if this is a route that you do want to go down? Or do you just want to leave that at the door and just focus on interviews with the tourists and the guides?
No, I think we will be doing participant observation as well, Daniela, and particularly of those mediation activities. So looking at the lectures and so forth, the guiding. And of course, you know, we do have to take into account our own backgrounds in that. Like any researcher, there's no way around that. I think we're just going to have to be really self-reflexive when we write it up and make it clear what direction we're coming from. Unless you have some advice on how we can do anything different to that.
And thanks for that response. And Daniela has a question as well. Daniela Cajiao. Daniela, we can't actually hear you at the moment.
It's quite disconcerting for me too, because I can't see anybody. It's all black. It's just me and a lot of black screens.
If there's a challenge with the sound, we can try and come back to you, Daniela, or if it's not connecting properly, we can pop that in the chat as well. Yes, we'll pop it in the chat. Okay, and we'll come back to that one in the chat. Sorry about that difficulty there. We had a couple of questions, I guess, for all the panelists here as well. In fact, I had one question for Daniela, but this one might need to be answered in the chat too. And that was to do with the penguin research. Had that impacted on any guidelines, for instance, of national Antarctic programs? Or has that made any changes to the way people are acting already? But for all of our panelists here today, we've heard a whole range of different themes coming through, things like safety, like ambassadorship, human impacts, or connection with place. I wonder, from your presentations and from what you've heard today in your wider research, what is it that you're most excited about in relation to Antarctic tourism research over the coming years? And what do you see as the biggest challenges associated with that as well? So the exciting part and the challenging part. And if we can touch on all our panelists to get your thoughts on that one. If anyone would like to go first, we can hand over to you.
I'll go first. That means I don't have to go last and come up with new ideas. I think what's really exciting is the global effort that's going into Antarctica. I think on the call we have, I don't even know how many continents, but lots, if not almost all of them. And actually we all work together really well. I know all of us on the screen are quite familiar and quite connected in many other projects. So I guess a call to anyone listening or who is new to this topic that is really interested, then please do get in touch with us. And I'm sure one of us can connect you to someone else who can probably really help you. So I would say that's what excites me most about it, is the global approach to solutions.
Yeah, thanks for that, Christy. So the general questions there, I'll pop them in the chat as well. What are you most excited about, and what do you see as the biggest challenge as well? Dorgach, I wonder if we might come over to you next. What are you most excited about in terms of tourism research over the coming years?
The increasing of people is really exciting. First of all, we need to say that, because it's not just increasing, and it's not just the idea of the discovering the around the world, but also it's really important duty to explain the global climate change to all the citizens and to around. I mean, when the citizens visit the Antarctica as a tourist, also there are new ambassadors. With these conditions, the education and outreach, which I really paid attention, especially in my country, to explain the effects of the global climate change. And this is not only one, but also to how can we respect the nature. So I believe that these tourism interest also helps to other people who are not visited to Antarctica, having much more awareness on the global and the environment.
Thank you for that. And I see Yu-Fai is indicating he'd like to speak next.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Okay, so I agree with Christy about that. Well, that's almost one of, I think, the most exciting thing is that the momentum that we are building. And I'm kind of recent come out of this committee, but I kind of feel like I have also made a little effort to bring people together, and also maybe bring a little bit of different insights from other places, other protected areas, my engagement with other projects. So I think that with the pandemic, which I know is a bad thing, but also give us this momentum and this opportunity to bring us together and to think really seriously about the future. And then in the past, I mean, people get busy with their business and with our things. And so nothing really happened a lot, but with this, I just call like anthropos, we can't just go back to the world like the same way. I think that would be a huge missed opportunity for humanity. And I think Antarctica has like a unique kind of attraction, a unique kind of opportunity to bring humanity together. So perhaps we can work together, and perhaps what we find out, our knowledge, building our knowledge, using our technology, perhaps we can help the continent as a good, like a best practice for the other continents, which is probably more complex in some way in terms of the governance, in terms of the communities and so forth. So I kind of see that this is as a wonderful opportunity for us to work together in the coming few years at least, and then hopefully would go way beyond that.
Thank you, Yu-Fai. We'll pop over to Ali. And Ali, I see we had also that question from Daniela in the chat. Are you planning on conducting the same in the Arctic to make a comparison? So perhaps you could touch on that also.
Yeah, I actually just responded. I thought I responded in the chat to say that, yeah, we don't have imminent plans for that, but we're very open to it in the future. And in a sense, this is a really exploratory project. As I said, there's not been a lot of work done on mediation in the Antarctic context. So depending on our results, yeah, we'd be very keen to expand that to other operators, both north and south. In terms of the general questions, I mean, this relates to what I've just been saying. To me, one of the most exciting things is the potential for partnership. And I say that as someone who's come, I mean, my background's in English literature. I've come from a kind of ivory tower idea of the academic where you're in your room reading books and just thinking your own thoughts. And I've moved in my career to a place where I'm really interested in doing much more practical work that's useful for people in the world, so to speak. And to be doing that in co-designing with people in the industry, it's a challenge for me, but it's also really exciting. And then the other question about what's sort of the big challenge facing the sector going forward, I think one of them is the lack of social license for tourism, Antarctic tourism. Another project that I'm involved in, which is looking at Australian public attitudes towards activities in Antarctica, shows really, really low results on tourism. It's down with mining, essentially, which surprises me. And I'm always surprised anecdotally when I mention Antarctic tourism to colleagues and so forth, the kind of knee-jerk hostility that produces, and also the kind of ignorance about the industry, which is behind that hostility, I think. So I think we have a big education job to do, although we also need to maintain neutrality as academics, and that's another challenge with the partnership piece as well. So yeah, that's my take.
Thanks very much for that, Ali. And I think that also speaks to Daniela Liggett's question there, which is posed to the panelists about the main challenge for tourism operators and those involved in managing and regulating tourism, and what is our role as researchers in this context, which is also something that our panelists may have a further comment on. But I know we will come up to Daniela Cajiao now to give your thoughts on those, the challenges and the opportunities. And we're not connecting very well. Luckily, we had you for the presentations, but there's a bit of an issue there. So if you'd like to share some thoughts with everyone in the chat there, I can also read those out so that those listening can hear that too, in case that chat's not accessible. I wonder if there were any other comments from our panelists on that final question, though. You know, what is our role as researchers in this particular context? Or Daniela Liggett, you may also have some thoughts once we've heard from people there too. Yeah, Christy, go ahead.
Sure, thanks. I think collaboration is key here, and I think there's a lot of best practice now coming out of the work that we do. So linking theory to get publications, I think, is part of our jobs, of course. But actually knowing what the practical impacts of those are. So it's so encouraging. I think this is quite a rare format that I sit in with academics in a room saying, oh, we've partnered with Intrepid, or we are working with, you know, another tour operator. So I think that collaboration can continue and just can continue to grow. And it's great. I try to work with partners in every piece of work that I do, because to me, that's the magic of research. When you can see it making a difference, that's kind of what gets me up every day. And I think we can inspire more of our colleagues to do that. I think we'll be in a good position moving forward as academics as impact becomes more important, and rightly so.
Yeah, thanks for that, Christy. And we've got a comment here from Daniela Cajiao as well. We need to better communicate our results in a way that a policymaker could understand and clearly use in their decisions. So it's really interesting to see where this conversation is going about these different audiences as well. And a lot of the work that we're doing here as academics is speaking to those different audiences, to other academics, to those involved in the tourism, to those policymakers as well, and those making the decisions in these areas. And so, yeah, I think you had a comment further on that.
Yeah, thank you very much for giving me the floor. And then I was about to say the science diplomacy, but the thanks to you, all the researchers here, the Daniela and Ellie and the Christy, almost say the same thing. I think we should play the role while using the science with the mind and the science of the science to show the policymakers and to have much more efficient communication between the all parties. Thank you.
Thank you for that. And I see Daniela's got a comment here as well, which might be our final comment today before we wrap up. So Daniela Liggett, I'll hand to you.
Thank you, Hanne. I didn't want to be the one making the final comment here, but seeing you encouraged me to say something about where I see the role of tourism researchers in general in the future. I think pretty much along the lines of what Ellie already touched on with regard to opening dialogue and conversations around completely different perspectives of what role tourism can serve, what some of the main impacts are, what the challenges are, and how tour operators and also researchers can work alongside policymakers in order to determine the best possible path ahead. And as we've seen in the future, I mean, the policymakers themselves have a lot of challenges, and there's a lot of diversion and a lot of opposition amongst the parties towards certain actions. So I think communication is really, really important, and sharing perspectives and maybe those mediated experiences of tourists and our roles in that kind of research can help provide some opportunities to connect on different levels and actually share that there's different cultural perspectives, which I think is true everywhere, and it's true in the Antarctic Treaty Consultative System, and that's what they're really struggling with. But maybe from a tourism lens, you can bring in some of the more practical activities to connect better. I don't know whether that makes any sense, but I think that's where our role is in that regard. And I think we can be brave and can be much more outspoken. The recent Antarctic Treaty Consultative meeting has shown that the parties are looking for our input and perspectives. And I think we need to be much more, don't want to call it aggressive, but much more focused with also offering it. Thanks, Hanne.
Thank you very much for that perspective, Daniela. Of course, you're involved in many of these different avenues with that governance side of things as well. So I think that's really useful to think about here at the end. And just from the comments as well, we had a comment that the startup small businesses could also play a role in helping build tourism or best practices. So it seems like really central here is that idea of communication and collaboration and having in mind that goal of what's best for Antarctica, because I think we've seen today a lot of care for this place and a lot of care across this conference in general too. We have reached the end of our time here. So for more on Antarctic tourism, you can head over to the SCAR website, the Tourism Action Group and TAG. I'd like to thank the conveners of this particular session, Daniela Liggett, Daniela Cajiao, Karen Alexander, Marisol Vereda, Yu-Fai, Leung, Gabriela, Roldan, and I'm Hanne Nielsen, your chair today. Thanks SCAR and our Indian hosts and our tech support team, and of course, again, all of today's presenters. And I hope some of these ideas that have been coming up and these conversations that have started will continue beyond these 2 hours. So thank you, everyone, and we'll wrap that up here.
Thank you, Hanne. Thanks everyone for listening.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
It was lovely. Thank you.
Great work, Hanne. Thank you.